Hi, Super Relaxed Fantasy Club. I'm Iona Datt Sharma. I'm a science fiction and fantasy writer living in London. Mostly I write short stories. I'm working on a novel, but mostly what I've had published is short science fiction and fantasy stories, mostly about everyday people and ordinary things. I had a collection come out last year, not for use in navigation, here it is, with its lovely watercolour cover. So that came out in the middle of 2019, and it collected nearly all of my short stories to date, and there were a few additional ones in there. Mostly the additional ones were the stories I call my Aqua and Birbal stories. So these are folk tales, kind of. So the Emperor Akbar was a real person. He was the third Mughal emperor of India, and he wasn't ancient history. He was emperor from 1506 to 1605, I think it was. So he's not way back in the mists of time or anything like that. But for one reason or another, Akbar has entered Indian folklore. He and his chief advisor, whose name was Birbal. Birbal as a name means, mighty military warrior, and it seems quite clear that Akbar called him that because that was precisely what he wasn't. He was clever and witty, and he was, for the most part, a needle in Akbar's side. He usually had advice for sticky situations, and not always advice that Akbar wanted to hear. So in the stories, it's always some problem that Akbar faces, and Birbal comes with a clever solution. Sometimes they argue, mostly they're friends at the end of the story. Birbal is a trickster, and Akbar is an emperor, and they're very sweet and they're very funny often, but mostly what I like about them is they're stories about an emperor who was more or less an absolute ruler, but learning how to constrain and use his power in ways that were good for his people, and Birbal helps him do that. He takes Birbal's advice, and sometimes Birbal shows up that he's letting his absolute power go to his head a little bit, but they are always friends again at the end. So I grew up with these stories, and the fun thing I did with them for this collection was do my own versions in a science fictional sort of a way. So my versions are gender swapped and space opera, so they're not that close to the original setting, but I think they're the same in their spirit, and certainly I've used some of the traditional folktale versions of them in my versions. So there are 4 of them in the collection. They're fables, so they're short. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a couple of them for you. The first one is called Akbar and the Crows. So, and after the campaigns of conquest were over, Akbar laid down her arms and returned to Fatehpur Sikri, which had been the capital of the empire in her great-grandfather's great-grandfather's day. The great flagships were placed in mooring orbits, the soldiers were made a gift of their vacuum-proof armour, which could be sold for value, and discharged, and the imperial retinue, which had been a space-borne capital in itself, of generals and soldiers, quartermasters and chaprasi, came down from the heavens and settled around Akbar's Darbar, the court of an emperor who must now rule in peace. It was a dusty, strange place that Akbar found herself in those days. The sun shone, except when it did not. The monsoon rains came, except when they did not. Akbar summoned her court meteorologist. "Sahib," she said, "tomorrow I wish to hunt. What will the weather be like?" "It will be fine, Hazur," said the court meteorologist. "Except, of course, if it is not." "Shall it rain?" Akbar asked. "No, Hazur, unless it does, in which case it shall." "Had I asked my military astronomers for the times of the eclipses," said Aqua, they would have told me the very hour and minute. Things are different on the ground, Hazur, said the meteorologist. Akbar did not send the meteorologist away from the Durbar, as his daughters were in school in Fatehpur Sikri and would be much disturbed by the upheaval. But she was still brooding on the matter when word came from a provincial mantri that famine had struck the world of Kalb Alri, some 80 light years off, and starving for lack of grain and digestible proteins. How can this be? Akbar demanded, when the mantri's messenger came with his report. Janpana, these things happen, said the messenger, who was not a courageous man. He was thinking of a previous courier with whom Akbar had been displeased, and the jar of ashes that man's family had received. They should not, Akbar said. Send for the chief agronomist. The chief agronomist came. He explained that harvests had failed on 2 of the colonies within the system of Kalb Alri, that the closest inhabited systems were still some distance, and in any case their resources were stretched, that food was required for their own people and could not be spared. When a supply line was cut, said Akbar, my quartermasters adapted their plans. They diverted resources from elsewhere in my spaceborne forces. My soldiers did not go hungry. No, Hazur, said the chief agronomist. You are quite correct. Your soldiers lacked for nothing. He paused over what he would say next. But he was a principled man, unlike the mantri's messenger, who had been sent to the kitchens during the chief agronomist's explanations, and was now drowning his apprehensions in fruit juice and sherbet. Remember that Akbar was brave and skillful, a fine leader who had raised her people to the stars. But at that time she was a young woman at the start of her reign, trying to understand everything new to her. Remember also that the chief agronomist had students and daughters and plenty of both. Janpana, he said, your armies had the best of everything. Where they were in need, the quartermasters requisitioned civilian supplies. Even in those days, some among your people starved. I see, Aqua said. The chief agronomist held his breath, wondering if he too would be sent home to his family in a ceramic jar. But Akbar was not angry. You must advise me, Saab, she said. What should be done for the people of Kalb Alri? The chief agronomist consulted with the court economists, and they brought scholars of xenobotany to the Durbar from across the galaxy. Akbar ensured they had access to the best expertise and left them to their work. Her generals had pushed figurines over table maps, taking time and care over their strategizing, and Akbar understood that haste would avail them of nothing. But it was a long wait, and with each day that passed, Akbar thought of the hunger of Kalb Alri, and the hunger of people she had not known of before she came to this dusty place on the ground. On the 6th day after the arrival of the provincial mantri's messenger, the advisers produced their report, setting out how the effect of famine might be lessened, if not eradicated, and how such a thing might be avoided in the future. Akbar asked that their course of action be checked by independent scholars, and instructed the imperial treasury to fund its implementation. And when that was done, Akbar rose from her dais and said, Birbal, walk with me. Rani Birbal was a poet among Akbar's Noratna, a witty and intelligent Brahmin who on happier days needled Akbar like a gadfly. She went quietly with her friend into the great gardens surrounding Fatehpur Sikri and asked, How may I assist you, Hazur? An emperor, particularly a young and inexperienced emperor, may not show weakness. Rather than speak of what troubled her, Akbar pointed at the flock of black birds gathering around the edge of the ponds, and asked, What sort of birds are those, Birbal? Those are carrion crows, Hazur, said Birbal. They pick the flesh of dead things, so the bones are clean and do not fester or cause disease. And how many crows are there in my kingdom? There are 540,312 crows in your kingdom, said Birbal. How can you be so sure? Akbar asked. Very little is certain in this country. Perhaps I shall commission a report and have them counted. You may do so, Hazur. And what if the number it gives is lower than yours? That is simple, Birbal said. Some of our crows will have gone on pilgrimage to other kingdoms. And if my commission finds that the number is higher? Then other crows have come to visit their relatives in your kingdom, Huzur. Akbar laughed and was a little reconciled to the strangeness of life on the ground. So that's Akbar and the crows. I'm going to read you one more, which is Akbar learns to read and write. So you may wonder how it was that Akbar, whose strategizing had taken battalions to the stars, who took poets as well as generals on galactic campaigns, and who loved the art and literature of her people with a passionate, critical love, came to be illiterate. And you may wonder how she remained so, even after she had led armies, conquered worlds, and ordered their libraries be catalogued. I'm afraid I do not know the answer for this. It may be that the child Akbar was disobedient and could not be stilled long enough to study. She was heard to say to her tutors that the letters were unruly. Alif and Mim unravelled like string in front of her eyes, and perhaps it was more difficult for her than the other children. After the wars were over, I suspect it was because she was ashamed of her lack. When she resolved that she must learn, for the sake of her people as well as herself, she asked that it might be kept a private matter. Birbal, who loved her well, arranged that it should be so. You must remember how young Akbar was then, and how prideful. In the dignity of her later years, she read well but slowly, and would encourage the children of her Navratnas to come to the dais and lead her through the obfuscations of the court economists. But that is another story. The tutor that Birbal found was a brisk and kind woman. Janpana, she said, we learn at any age. She had taught grown men who had played truant during their schooling and gone on to regret it. She had taught soldiers who had spent their lives on Akbar's campaigns and come home knowing only the scripts of other worlds. She had taught a woman whose father's house had been a petty tyranny, whose freedom to learn had come with her marriage. There were always reasons, which were not important. What was important was the student's application. So Akbar settled down to her studies, and in due course Alif and Mim ceased to dance around the page and came obediently from her pen. On a day of rain, some months after Akbar had begun her lessons, she noticed that her teacher seemed listless. What troubles you, Adhyakya Sahiba? Akbar asked. Does it surprise you that Akbar addressed her thus? Akbar accorded her advisers respect and her teachers too. The teacher did not at first wish to speak of it, but the afternoon was cool and pleasant, and Akbar a willing listener. It seemed that there was to be a sitar recital in the darbar that day, given by a well-respected man, known throughout the kingdom for his talent. He was the brother of Akbar's tutor, and although she was pleased to see him perform to such acclaim, he brought to mind a secret sorrow. She had had talent of her own in her childhood, but she had been lazy about studying the instrument and squandered her opportunity to play alongside him. Akbar said, Adhyakya Sahiba, we learn at any age. After the lesson was over, she went to Birbal and asked if someone might be found who could teach the sitar to a beginner, privately, with consideration for a long-ago regret. Birbal said, It shall be done, Huzur. The darbar was full of musicians and those who loved music, and they directed Birbal to a man who had been a flagship musician during the campaigns, and who lived in a quiet retirement in Agra. He was happy to take Akbar's tutor as his pupil and teach her the music he loved. Now this man was a widower. His wife had died from a sudden illness soon after their return to Earth, and his grief had been all the more terrible for its being unexpected. When the first cloud of it had passed, he found that his 10-year-old son, who had been the apple of his mother's eye, now looked at his father as though he were a stranger. A good boy, he told Birbal, a good, obedient boy who works hard at his studies, but I know nothing of him. What does he enjoy, this good boy of yours? Birbal asked. If you give him a little money to spend and a day free of study, what does he do? The sitar player did not know. He went home and gave his son a coin and said he should do with it as he pleased. He came back to Birbal to say he had seen his son and his friends on the curve of hillside above the palace, flying their kites in the spring breezes. Well, sir, Birbal said, We must teach you how to fly a pathon." The sitar player agreed that this perhaps would bring him closer to his son, but he was apprehensive. How, he asked, does a man who is nearly 40 years old, who was always consumed by his art and never by the joys of his school friends, learn to unroll a string and catch a wind? For once it was Akbar who said, "It shall be done, my friend." You may recall that Akbar had a son, Jahangir, who had been born on campaign. Back on Earth he was unruly, as Akbar herself had been, and more inclined towards playing carom and roaming the hills than working at his lessons. Akbar had seen him flying kites above the battlements, and she meant to promise him some sweetmeat or trinket if he would teach the sitar player how to do the same. But then she remembered Jahangir's tutors had said he was shiftless, that he took no responsibility, and it occurred to her that to take responsibility one must have responsibility. She told him of the sitar player's son, her tutor's regrets, and although it troubled her to speak of it, her own illiteracy. "I owe this man a debt," she said. "You must discharge it for me." Jahangir said, "Amma, I will try." Birbal was one of Jahangir's tutors who believed he was lacking in application, but she trusted Akbar's judgment, and she was not wrong to do so. On breezy mornings, when Birbal breakfasted with Akbar on the veranda, they would see Jahangir climbing up to the battlements with the sitar player, and from the voices carried in the wind they learned that Jahangir was a patient teacher. "You see, Birbal," Akbar said, "I cannot teach him to read and write, nor to play the sitar. I cannot teach him geography or history or languages. I can teach him to take care of his people, and that only." "It is not a little thing, Azur," said Birbal. After that Jahangir gave his tutors less trouble, and Akbar too studied hard. Reading remained a chore for her. She always preferred to hear the poets recite and the musicians sing, but she could make her way through a dispatch from her frontiers, and through a column of figures, and was content. Among her musicians was her tutor, who struggled with her technique no matter how hard she practiced, but she was persistent, and Akbar liked to hear her. Grief is a terrible thing, and it did not lift easily from the sitar player and his son. But they walked the hills together with their brightly coloured kites, and it came to pass that they found contentment again. And as you will have learned in school, dear reader, Jahangir became the 4th emperor of the greatest empire ever seen. But that too is another story. So that's Akbar Learns to Read and Write. There are 2 other stories about them in the collection, but those 2 would give you a taster of what they're like. So that's all I've got for you. The last thing I'm going to say is just do a quick plug for another book. So this is Consolation Songs. This is an anthology that I edited. It came out at the end of June. It's an anthology of optimistic science fiction and fantasy. It's in aid of the UCLH charity, so it's in aid of COVID-19 research and support. So it's a great cause. All the royalties go to UCLH, and it has a number of extremely talented contributing authors, some of which are Super Relaxed Fantasy Club authors as well. So if you want to check that out, or you want to check out Not for Use in Navigation, which Akbar and Birbal are in, you can see my website, which is www.generalist.org.uk/Iona, and if you want to check out my Twitter, it's @SingleCrow. That's it. Thank you very much.